A Body of Doctrinal Divinity by Dr. John Gill, Book 1, Chapter 1 of the Being of God, narrated by David Clark.
Having undertaken to write a system of theology or a body of doctrinal divinity, and theology being nothing else than a speaking of God or a discoursing concerning him, his nature, names, perfections, and persons, his purposes, providences, ways, works, and word, I shall begin with the being of God, and the proof and evidence of it, which is the foundation of all religion. For if there is no God, religion is a vain thing, and it matters not what we believe nor what we do, since there is no superior being to whom we are accountable for either faith or practice. Some, because of the being of God is a first principle which is not to be disputed, and because that there is one is a self-evident proposition, not to be disproved, have thought it should not be admitted as a matter of debate. But since such is the malice of Satan, as to suggest the contrary to the minds of men, and such the badness of some wicked men as to listen to it and imbibe it, and such the weakness of some good men to be distressed and distressed with doubts about it at times, it cannot be improper to endeavour to fortify our minds with reasons and arguments against such suggestions and insinuations. And 1. My first argument to prove the being of God shall be taken from the general consent of men of all nations, in all ages of the world, among whom belief of it has universally obtained, which is not reasonable to suppose would have been obtained if it was not true. This has been observed by many heathen writers themselves. Aristotle says, all men have a persuasion of deity, or that there is a God. Cicero observed, there is no nation so wild and savage whose minds are not imbibed with the opinion of the gods. Many entertain wrong notions of them, but all suppose and own the divine power and nature. And in another place he says, there is no animal besides man that has any knowledge of God, and of men there is no nation so untractable and fierce, although it may be ignorant what a God it should have, yet it is not ignorant that one should be had. And again, it is a sense of all mankind that it is innate in all, and as it were engraven on the mind, that there is a God. But what a one he is, in that they vary, but that he is, none denies. And to the same sense are the words of Seneca, there never was a nation so desolate and abandoned, so lawless and immoral, as to believe there is no God. So Elinus relates, none of barbarous nations ever fell into atheism, or doubted of the gods, whether they were or not, or whether they took care of human affairs or not. Not the Indians, not the Gauls, nor the Egyptians. And Plutarch has these remarkable words, if you go over the earth, he says, you may find cities without walls, letters, kings, houses, wealth, money, devoid of theatres and schools, but a city without temples and gods, and where there is no use of prayers, oaths, and oracles, or sacrifice to obtain good or avert evil, no man ever saw. These things were observed and said when the true knowledge of God was in a great measure lost, and idolatry prevailed, and yet even then this was the general sense of mankind. In the first ages of the world, men universally believed in the true God and worshipped him, as Adam and his sons and their posterity, until the flood. Nor does there appear any trace of idolatry there, nor for some time after. The sins which caused that, and with which the world was filled, seemed to be lewdness and uncleanness, rapine and violence. Some think the Tower of Babel was built for an idolatrous use, and it may be that about that time idolatry was set up. It is thought to have prevailed in the days of Serug, and it is very probable that when the greater part of the posterity of Adam's sons were dispersed throughout the earth and settled in the distant parts of it, that they were remote from those among whom the true worship of God was preserved. They, by degrees, lost sight of the true God and forsook his worship. And this being the case, they began to worship the sun in his stead, and which led on to the worship of the moon and the host of heaven, which seemed to be the first objects of idolatry. This was as early as the times of Job, who plainly refers to it, Job 31, 26 and 27. And indeed, when men had cast off the true object of worship, what more natural to substitute in his room than the sun, the moon, and the stars, which were above them, visible to them, and so glorious in themselves, and so beneficial to the earth and men on it. Hence the people of Israel were exhorted to take care that their eyes were not ensnared at the sight of them, to fall down to worship them, and which in latter times they did. Deuteronomy 4:19, 2 Kings 21:3. It appears also that men took very early to the deification of their heroes after death, their kings and great personages, either for their wisdom and knowledge, or for their courage and valour, and martial exploits, and other things. Such were the Bel, or Belus, of the Babylonians, or Baal-Peor of the Moabites, and the Molech of the Phoenicians, and other Baalim lords, or kings mentioned in the Scripture. And such were Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Mercury, Hercules, and the rest of the rabble of the heathen deities. And indeed, their lairs and penates, or household gods, were no other than the images of their deceased parents, or more remote ancestors, whose memory they revered, and in process of time their deities became very numerous. They had gods many and lords many, even with the Jews, when fallen into idolatry. Their gods were according to the number of their cities, Jeremiah 2:28. And as for the Gentiles, they worshipped almost everything, not only the sun, the moon, the stars, but the earth, fire, water, various sorts of animals, of oxen, goats, swine, cats, dogs, and fish of the rivers, the river horse and the crocodile, those amphibious creatures, the fowls of the air, as the hawk, the stork, the ibis, and even insects and fly, yea, creeping things, as serpents, the beetle, and also vegetables, onions, and garlic, which occasioned the satirical poets to say, O sanctus genitus, quibus hucec nascuntur in Horatius animae, O holy nations, whose gods are born in their gardens. Nay, some have worshipped the devil himself, as both in the East and the West Indies, and that for this reason, that he might not harm them. Now, though all these betray the dreadful depravity of human nature, the wretched ignorance of mankind, and the sad stupidity men were sunken into, yet, at the same time, such shocking idolatry, in all the branches of it, it is full proof of the truth and force of my argument that all men in all ages and countries have been possessed with the notion of a God, since rather than have no God, they have chosen false ones. So deeply rooted is a sense of deity in the minds of men. I am sensible that to this it is objected that there have been at different times and in different countries some particular persons who have been reckoned atheists, deniers of the being of God. But some of these men are only deriders of the gods of their country. They mock at them as unworthy of their name, as weak and insufficient to help them, as they reasonably might, just as Elijah mocked Baal and his worshippers. Now, the common people, because they have behaved towards their gods, looked upon them as atheists, as such who did not believe there was any God. Others were so accounted because they excluded the gods from any concern with human affair. They thought they were otherwise employed, and that such things as were below their notice, and not becoming their grandeur and dignity to regard, and had much the same sentiments as some of the Jews had, Ezekiel 9:9, Zephaniah 1:12. But these men were not deniers of the existence of God, only of his providence to the affairs of the world, and others have been rather practical than speculative atheists. as the fool in Psalm 14, verse 1, who not only lives as if there was no God, but wishes in his heart there was none, rather than believe there is none, that so they might take their fill of sin without being accountable to a superior being. The number of real speculative atheists have been very few, if any. Some have boldly asserted their disbelief in a God, but it is a question whether their hearts and mouths have agreed. At least they've not been able to maintain their unbelief for long without some doubts and fears, and at most this only shows how much the reason of man may be debased and how low it may sink when left to itself. These few instances are only particular exceptions to the general rule, which is not destroyed thereby, being contrary to the common sense of mankind, even as it is no sufficient objection to the definition of man as a rational creature, that there is now and then an idiot born of his race. So not to the general disbelief of deity, that there is now and then an atheist in the world. It is further objected that there have been whole nations in Africa and America who have no notion of deity, but this is what has not been sufficiently proved. It depends upon the testimonies of travellers, and what one affirms, another denies, so that nothing can certainly be concluded from them. I should rather question, says Herbert Lord Cherbury, whether the light of the sun has shone on the remotest regions than that the knowledge of the Supreme Being is hidden from them. Since the sun is only conspicuous in its own sphere, but the Supreme Being is seen in everything. Diodorus Siculus says, a few of the Ethiopians were of the opinion there was no God, though before he had presented them as the first and most religious of all nations, as attested by all antiquity. The Hottentots about the Cape of Good Hope have been instanced as without any knowledge of deity, and certainly they are a most beastly and brutish people. They can be named and the most degenerate of human species, and have survived the common instinct of humanity. Yet, according to Mr. Colben's account of them, published some years ago, they appear to have some sense of a supreme being and of inferior deities. They express a superstitious joy at the new and full moons, and it is said that they pray to a being that dwells above and offer sacrifice of the best things they have, with eyes lifted up to heaven, and later discoveries of other nations show the contrary to what has been attested of them, which assertions have arose either from want of intimate knowledge of them and familiar acquaintance with them, or from their destitute, wicked and irreligious lives, when by conversing with them it appears that they have a notion of the sun or sky or something or other being a sort of deity. Thus it has been observed of the Greenlanders that they had neither religion nor idolatrous worship, nor so much as any ceremonies to be perceived tending to. Hence the first missionaries entertained a supposition that there was not the least trace to be found among them of any conception of a divine being, especially as they had no word to express him by. But when they came to understand their language better, they found quite the reverse to be true, from the notions they had, through very vague and various concerning the soul and concerning spirits, and also from their anxious solicitude about the state after death. And not only so, but they could plainly gather from a free dialogue that they had with some perfectly wild Greenlanders that their ancestors must have believed a supreme being and did render him some service, which their posterity neglected little by little, and further they were removed from the more wise and civilized nations, till at last they lost every just concept of the deity. Yet after all, it is manifest that a faint idea of a divine being lies concealed in the minds of even this people, because they directly assent without any obligation to the doctrine of a God and his attributes. And as to what is concluded from the religious lives of the inhabitants of some nations, we need not be sent to Africa, America, for such atheists as these. We have enough of them in our own nation, and I was just ready to say we are a nation of atheists in this sense, and indeed all men in an unregenerate state be they Jew or Gentile, or live where they may, they are aioi, atheists, as the Apostles calls them, Ephesians 2:12. They are without God in the world, being alienated from the life of God, Ephesians 4:18. Otherwise, there is such a general sense of deity in mankind, and such a natural inclination to religion of some sort or other, though ever so bad, that some have thought that man should rather be defined as a religious rather than rational animal. I take no notice of the holy angels who worship God continually, nor of the devils who believe there is one God and tremble, my argument being only concerned with men. 3. The third argument proving the being of God shall be taken from the works of creation, concerning which the Apostle Paul says, the invisible things of God from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, Romans 1:20. Plutarch, in answer to a question, whence have men the knowledge of God, replies, they first receive the knowledge of him from the beauty of things that appear. For nothing beautiful is made in vain, nor by chance, but wrought by some art. That the world is beautiful is manifest from the figure, the colour, the magnitude of it, and from the variety of the stars above the world. And these so clearly display the being and power of God as to leave the heathen without excuse. As the Apostle Paul observes, and as this and other instances show, most admirable was the reasoning of the wild Greenlander, which he declared to a missionary to be the reasoning of his mind before his conversion. He said to him, "It is true, we are ignorant heathens and know nothing of God or a Saviour, and indeed, who shall tell us of him till you came? But thou must not imagine no Greenlander thinks about these things. I myself have often thought a kayak, a boat, with all its tackle and implements, does not grow into existence of itself, but must be made by the labour and ingenuity of man, and one that does not understand it would directly spoil it. Now, the meanest bird has more skill displayed in its structure than the best kayak, and no man can make a bird. But there is still a far greater art shown in the formation of a man than of any other creature. Who was it that made him? I thought myself that he possessed from his parents, and they from their parents, but some must have been the first parents. Whence did they come? Common report informs me they grew out of the earth. But if so, why does it not still happen that men grow out of the earth? And from whence did this same earth itself, the sea, the sun, the moon, the stars, arise in existence? Certainly there must be some being who made all these things, a being that always was and can never cease to be. He must be inexpressibly more mighty, knowing and wise than the wisest man. He must be very good too, because that everything that he has made is good, useful and necessary for us. Ah, did I but know him! How would I love him and honour him? Who hath seen him? Who has ever conversed with him? None of us poor men. Yet there may be men too that know something of him. Oh, that I could speak with such. Therefore, he said, as soon as I ever heard you speak of this great being, I believed it directly with all my heart, because I had so long desired to hear it. A glaring proof this, that a supreme being, the first cause of all things, is to be concluded from the works of creation. The notion of the eternity of the world has been imbibed by some heathens, but sufficiently confuted by others, and then Aristotle, to whom it is ascribed, asserts that it was an ancient doctrine, and what all men receive from their ancestors, that all things are of God and consists by him. And these that believe the divine revelation cannot admit of any other doctrine, but must explode the notion of the eternity of the world, and of its being of itself, since that assures us that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Also, that all things were made not of things which do appear, but out of nothing. Genesis 1 verse 1 and Hebrews 11 verse 3. For be it that the heavens and the earth were made out of chaos or out of pre-existent matter, it may be reasoned, asked out of what the pre-existent matter made. The answer must be out of nothing, since it was by creation. which is the production of something out of nothing, and which can never be performed by the creature. For out of nothing, nothing can be made by that. If therefore all things are originally produced out of nothing, it must be by one that is almighty, whom we rightly call God. No creature can produce itself. This involves such contradictions as can never be admitted, for then a creature must be before it was, as that which makes must be before that which is made. It must act and operate before it exists, and be and not be at one and the same time, which are such glaring contradictions as sufficiently confute the creature's making itself, and therefore its being must be owing to another cause, even to God the Creator. For between a creature and God there is no medium, and if it could be thought or said that the most excellent creatures men made themselves, besides the above contradictions which would be implied, it must be asked, why did not they make themselves wiser and better, since it is certain they have knowledge of beings superior to them? And how is it that they know so little of themselves, either of their bodies or of their souls, if both were made by them? And why are they not able to preserve themselves from the desolation which they are subject? It may be further observed that effects which depend upon causes in subordinate to one to another cannot be traced up to ad infinitum, but must be reduced to some first cause, where the inquiry must rest, and that first cause is God. Now here is an ample field to survey, which furnishes out a variety of objects, the full proofs of deity. There is nothing in the whole of creation the mind can contemplate, the eye look upon, or hand lay hold on, but what proclaims the being of God. When we look up to the heavens above us, the surrounding atmosphere, the air in which we breathe, which compresses our earth and keeps it together, the stellar space and spreading sky, bespangled with stars of light, and adorned with two great luminaries, the sun and the moon, especially the former, what inexhaustible fountain of light and heat, and under whose benign influence so many things are brought forth on earth, whose circuit is from one end of the heaven to the other. There is nothing hid from the heat thereof. When we consider this form, magnitude, and virtue, its proper distance from us, being not so near to us, to scorch us, not too remote to be of no use to us, the motion given it at first, in which it is proceeded without stopping, but once, as is supposed in the days of Joshua, a motion it has made now almost 6,000 years. The course it has steered and steers, so that all parts of the earth, at one season or another, receive benefit by it, and the way it's being guided in, without varying or erring from it, all this while. Whoever reflects on these things must acknowledge it be the work of an almighty wise, almighty agent we call God, and that it must be upheld, guided, and directed by his hand alone. When we take a view of the earth, of the whole terraqueous globe, hanging on nothing, like a ball in the air, poised with its own weight, the different parts of it, and all disposed for the use of man, stored with immense riches in the heart of it, and stocked with habitations upon it, the various sorts of animals of different forms and shapes, made some for strength, some for swiftness, some for bearing burdens, other for drawing carriages, some for food, others for clothing, the vast variety of the feathered birds that cut the air, the innumerable kinds of fish that swim the ocean. The consideration of all this will oblige us to say, Lord, thou art God, which has made the heavens and the earth, and sea, and all that is in them is. Acts 4:25. In short, there is not a shell in the ocean, nor a sand on the shore, nor a spire of glass in the field, nor any flower of different hue and smell in the garden, but what declare the being of God. But especially our own composition is deserving of our notice, the fabric of the body, the faculties of the soul, the body, its form and shape, while other animals look downwards to the earth, osim homai, sublime, dedicatis dedit dies, as the poet says, man has a lofty countenance, given him to behold the heavens, to lift up his face to the stars, and for what is this erect posture given him, but to adore his Creator? And it is remarkable that there is a natural instinct in a man to lift up his hands and eyes to heaven, when either they have received any unexpected mercy or way of unthankfulness for it, or are in any way distressed, as supplicating deliverance from it, which supposes a divine being, to whom they owe the one, and from whom they expect the other. Each of the parts and members of the body are so framed and disposed as to be subservient to one another. So the eye cannot say to the hand, I have no need of thee, nor the head to the foot, I have need of you. The same may be observed of every other member. The inward parts, which are weak and tender, on which life much depends, were they exposed, will be liable to much danger and hurt. But these are clothed with skin and flesh, and fenced with bone and sinews, and every bone and every nerve and every muscle are put in their proper places. All the organs of the senses of sight, hearing, smell, taste, feeling are most wonderfully fitted for the purposes for which they are made. Galen, an ancient noted physician, being atheistically inclined, was convinced of this impiety by barely considering the admirable structure of the eye, its various humours, tunics, and provision for its defence and safety. The various operations performed in our bodies, many of which are done without our knowledge or will, are enough to raise the highest admiration in us, as the circulation of the blood through all the body, through all the parts of the body, in a very small space of time, the respiration of the lungs, the digestion of the food, the silification of it, the mixing of the chyle with the blood, the nourishment thereby communicated, and which is sensibly perceived in the several parts of the body, and even in the more remote, which have been wakened and enfeebled by hunger, thirst, and labour, are in any instance revived and strengthened, and the accretion and growth of parts by all this, to which may be added other things worthy of notice, the faculty of speech peculiar to man, and the organs of it, the features of their faces, and the shape of their bodies, which all differ from one another, the constant supply of animal spirits, the continuance of the vital heat, which itself fire itself, the slender threads and small fibres spread throughout the body, which hold and perform their office 70 or 80 years running, all which, when considered, will oblige us to say, with the inspired psalmist, I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvellous are thy works, and that my soul knoweth right well, and will lead us to ascribe thus curious piece of workmanship to no other than the divine being, the God of all flesh and living. But the soul of man, the more noble part of him, more fully discovers the original author of him, being possessed of such powers and faculties that none but God can give it. It is endowed with an understanding capable of receiving and framing ideas of all things knowable in matters natural, civil, and religious, and with reason, to put these things together and to compare them with each other and discourse concerning them, inferring one thing from another and draw conclusions from them, and with judgments by which it passes sentence on things it takes cognizance of and reason upon, and determines for itself what is right and wrong, and so either approves or disapproves. It has a mind, susceptive of what is proposed unto it. It can by instruction or study learn any language, cultivate any art or science, and with the help of some geographical principles can travel over the globe, can be here and there at pleasure, in the four parts of the world, and, in a short time, vast, every city of note therein, and describe the situation of every city with their religions, manners, customs, and it can reflect on things past, and has a foresight of, and can forecast and provide for things to come. It has a will to escape, to accept or reject, to embrace or refuse what is proposed to it, with the greatest freedom of choice and with the most absolute power and sovereignty. It has affections of love and hatred, joy and grief, hope and fear, according to the different objects it is conversant with. There is also the conscience which is in a man, as 1,000 witnesses for him or against him, which, if it performs its office, as it should do, will accuse him when he does ill, and commend him or excuse him when he does well, and from hence arise either peace of mind or dread of punishment, in such shape or other, either here or there, to which may be added the memory, which is a storehouse of collections of things thought to be most valuable and useful, where they are laid up, not in a confused but orderly manner, so as to be called from and taken out upon occasion. Here men of every character and profession lay up their several stores, to have recourse to, fetch out, as their case and circumstances may require. And besides this, there is the fancy of imagination, which can paint and describe to itself in a lively manner objects presented to it, and it has entertained a conception of, yea, it can fancy and imagine things that never were, nor never will be, and, to observe no more, there is the power of invention, which in some is more, in others less fertile, which on a sudden supplies with what is useful in the case of an emergency. But above all, the soul of man is that wherein chiefly lies the image and likeness of God. When man was in his pure and innocent state, and though it is now sadly depraved by sin, yet it is capable of being renewed by the Spirit of God, and of having the grace of God implanted in it, and is endowed with an immortality, and cannot die. Now to whom such a noble and excellent creature as this owes its origin, but to the divine being, who may with great priority be called the Father of spirits, the Lord, the Jehovah, who formeth the spirit of man within him.
The fourth argument will be taken from the suspension and government of the world, the provision made for the supply of creatures, and especially of man, and for his safety, as the world, as we have seen, is being made by a divine being. So by him it consists. Was there not such an almighty being who upholds all things by the word of his power? They would sink and fall. Did he not bear up the pillars of the earth? They would tremble and shake, and not be able to bear his weight. The most stately, firm, and well-built palace, unless repaired and maintained, will fall to decay and ruin. And so the grand and magnificent building of this world would soon be dissolved, did not the divine agent that made it kept it up. As he that built all things is God, so he that supports the fabric of the universe must be so too. No less than an almighty hand can preserve and continue it, and which has done it without any visible appearance of age and decay for almost 6,000 years. And though there is such a vast number of creatures in the world besides men and beasts of the field, and the cattle of 1,000 hills, the fowls of the air and the fishes of the sea, there is food provided for them all, and they have every one their portion of meat in due season. And as for man, he is richly provided for, with a plenty and variety of good things, not only for necessity, but for delight. Every man has a trade, business, or employment of life, or is put into such a situation and circumstances that, with care, diligence, and industry, he may have enough for himself and family to be spare. And earth provides a variety of things for food and drink for them, and of others for medicine, to the continuance of health and restoration of it. And can all this be without a care, providence, and interposition of a wise and almighty being? Can these ever be thought to be the effects of blind chance and fortune? Is it not plain and clear that God hereby has not left himself without a witness of his existence and providence, in that he does good to all his creatures and gives them rain from heaven and fruitful seasons, filling men's hearts with food and gladness, and continuing the certain and constant revolutions of summer, winter, seed-time harvest, as well as night and day, and heat, all which have their particular usefulness and advantages to human life, and cannot be attributed to anything less than the superintendence of the divine being. And as this is a provision made for the wants of men, so for their safety, were it not that God had put the fear of man upon the wild beasts of the field, and the dread of him in them, there would be no safety for him, especially in some parts of the world, and had he not put a natural instinct into them to avoid the habitations of men, and to resort to woods and deserts and dwell in uninhabited places, to prowl about for their prey in the night, and in the morning return to their caves and dens and lurking places. When men go forth to their work, and would be in the utmost danger of their lives, yet were it not for the overruling providence of God, which governs the world, and restrains the lusts of men. Homo est homini lucus, one man will be a wolf to another, and neither life nor property will be secure, but must fall a prey to the rapine and violence of powerful oppressors. Human laws and civil magistracy do some things to restrain men, but not everything. Notwithstanding these, we see what outrages are committed, and how greater still would be their number, was it not for the interposition of divine providence, and even if it is owing to the divine being that there are human forms of government and political schemes framed and laws made for the better regulation of mankind, and these continued, for it is by him kings reign and princes decree justice. And particularly, was it not for a divine agency, such as the rage and malice of Satan and his principalities and powers, whose numbers fill the surrounding air, and who go about our earth like roaring lions, seeking whom they may devour? Were they not chained by almighty power and limited by the providence of God, and the whole race of men would be destroyed by them, at least the godly among them? The fifth argument may be taken from the uncommon heroic actions of prodigies, wonders, and miraculous things done in the world, which cannot be thought to be done without superior and divine influence. Heroic actions such as that of Abraham, who with 300 household servants pursued after and engaged with 4 kings who had beaten 5 before, and recovered the goods that they had taken away. And Shamgar, who fought with and killed 600 Philistines with an ox goad. And of Samson, who slew 1,000 of them with the jawbone of an ass. And Jonathan and his armour-bearer, who attacked and took a garrison of the same people and threw the whole army of theirs into panic and confusion, who have been for some time a terror to the whole land of Israel. And of David, a stripling, fighting with and conquering Goliath, a monstrous giant. These are Scripture instances, and if Scripture is only regarded as a common history, these merit notice and credit. As any of the relations in profane history in which are recorded the magnanimous actions of heroes, kings and generals and armies, their wonderful successes and amazing conquests, as of the Babylonians, Persians, Grecians and the Romans, which made such strange revolutions and changes in kingdoms and states, all which can never be supposed to be done without superior power, and the overruling, influencing providence of divine being, who inspire men to do these things beyond their natural skill and courage, prodigies, strange and wonderful events, for which no natural cause can be assigned, such as the strange sights seen in the air, and voices heard in the temple before the destruction of Jerusalem, with their things relating to Josephus, and confirmed by Tacitus, and heathen historian, to which might be added many others, which histories abound with. But besides these things, really miraculous have been brought, such as are not only out of and beyond the course of nature, but contrary to it, and to the settled laws of it, such as the miracles of Moses, and the prophets, and of Christ and his apostles, which are recorded in the Scripture. The others in human writings, which are so well attested as oblige us to give credit to them. Now, though these were not done to prove the divine being, which needs them not, yet they necessarily suppose one, by whose power alone they are performed. The sixth argument may be formed from the prophecies of contingent future events, and the exact fulfilment of them. This is what is challenged and required from heathen deities to prove their right to such a character as being what none but God can do. Let them bring forth and show us what shall happen, or declare us things for to come. Show the things that have come hereafter, that we may know that ye are gods. That's a quotation from Isaiah 41, 21 and 22. Which is what none but the true God can do, and has done, and which, being done, proves there is a God, and one that is truly so, instances of which are many in the sacred writings, prophecies which relate both to particular persons and to whole kingdoms and states, which have had their exact accomplishment, but not to insist on these, since these who are atheistically inclined to disbelieve the divine revelation, let it be observed that the heathens have had their auguries, soothsayers, divinations, and oracles by which pretensions have been made to foretell future events. That there is such a thing as divination is said to be confirmed by the consent of all nations, and is explained by a presension and knowledge of future things. Now, this being granted, it may be reasoned upon that if there is a foretelling of future things, which certainly come to pass, there must be a God, since none but an omnipotent being can with certainty foretell what shall come to pass, which does not depend on necessary causes, and cannot be foreseen by the quickest sight and sharpest wit and sagacity of a creature. The seventh argument may be urged from the fears of men, and of the tortures of a guilty conscience, and the dread of a future state. Some are terribly afraid at thunder and lightning, as Caligula, the Roman emperor, used to be, who at such times would hide himself in or under his bed, and yet this man set himself up for a god. Now, these fears and frights are not merely on account of the awful sound of thunder and the dreadful flashes of lightning, but because of the divine and tremendous being who is supposed to send them. The heathens were sensible that thunder is the voice of God, as the Scriptures represent it, and therefore called their Jove, Jupiter, Tonans, the thundering Jupiter. Many have been so terrified in their consciences on account of sin that they could not rest, nor enjoy peace anywhere or by any means, as Cain, under the terrors of an evil conscience, fancied that everyone that found him would slay him. And those wicked traitors, Catiline and Jugurtha, and those wicked emperors, those monsters in impiety, Tiberius and Nero, and especially the latter, who was so tortured in his conscience as if he was continually haunted by his mother's ghosts, and by furies with burning torches, and Hobbes, our English atheist, as he was reckoned, was wont to be very uneasy when alone in the dark. And Epicurus, the philosopher, though he taught men to despise death, and outbraved it, yet when he perceived that he himself was about to die, was most terribly frightened. And this has been the case of many others. Bold and strong spirits, as atheistical persons love to be called, have been sometimes found to be very timorous and fearful, and indeed this is natural to all men, and which is proof of a divine being. Thus, a wild Greenlander argued, before he had knowledge of the true God, man has an intellectual soul, is subject to no creature in the world, and yet man is afraid of the future state. Who is it that is afraid of there? There must be a giant spirit that has dominion over us. Or did we but know him? Or had we but him for our friend? What do all these fears and tortures of conscience arise from, but from the guilt of sin and a sense of a divine being, who is above all men, and will call them to an account for their sins, and take vengeance on them? And indeed, the eternal punishment that will be inflicted on them will greatly lie in the tortures of their consciences, which is the worm that will never die, and in a sense the divine truth, which is that fire that will never be quenched. The eighth and last shall be taken from the judgments in the world, not only famine, sword, pestilence, earthquake, but such that have been inflicted on wicked men, and atheistical persons, perjured ones, blasphemers, and the like, not to take notice of the universal flood, which swept away a world of ungodly men, and of the burning of Sodom and Gomorrah, with other cities of the plain, by fire and brimstone from heaven, which yet were abundantly confirmed by the testimonies of heathen writers, nor of the wilful instances in the New Testament of Herod being smitten by an angel and eaten with worms and died, while the people were shouting him as a god. He assented to their flattery, and of Ananias and Sapphira being struck dead by lying unto God. Besides these, there are innumerable instances of judgments of the same for a like kind in all ages and countries recorded in the histories of them, and in our nation and in our age and within our knowledge. And who can hear or read such awful judgments and disbelieve the being of God?